The market at Krenwold smelled of fresh bread and river mud and the faint sweetness of apple blossoms drifting from the orchards at the edge of town. Sonara had learned, in the 4 years she had lived here, to love that smell. It meant safety. It meant another morning survived. It meant that the life she had carved out of nothing, in this quiet corner of the world where no one asked questions, and no one looked twice at a young widow with steady hands and a gift for mending wounds, was still intact. She adjusted the basket on her arm and kept her eyes on the stalls ahead, cataloging what she needed. Dried fennel for Widow Cobbin's joints, a length of clean linen for the carpenter's son, whose arm had not fully healed from last month's accident. A small jar of blackcurrant preserves because Oren had asked for them twice already this week, in the unmistakable tone that made refusing him feel like a crime against nature. As if he had heard his name in her thoughts, the boy materialized at her side, pressing his small, warm body against her hip and gazing up at a stall piled with carved wooden animals. "Mama," he said, in the voice that meant he had already decided what he wanted and was simply working out the best angle of approach. "No," she said. "You did not hear what I was going to say. I did not need to." He considered this with the philosophical patience of a 4-year-old who had learned that persistence was its own form of strategy, and moved on to pressing his nose against the glass jar of blackcurrant preserves at the next stall. Sonara allowed herself a small, private smile. He was so much himself. So entirely his own person, already. She had wondered, in the early months, whether she would see too much of his father in him and find it unbearable. She had been wrong. What she saw instead was someone new. Someone neither of them had managed to produce alone. She paid for the preserves and turned to tell him they were moving on. Oren was not looking at her. He was looking across the market square, his dark eyes fixed on something Sonara had not yet registered, his small brow furrowed with the focused intensity he used when he was trying to work something out. "Mama," he said slowly. "Oren, we need to get the linen before. That man is staring at you." Sonara stopped. The world did not tilt. It did not crack or shatter or roar. It simply went very, very quiet, the way the air goes quiet in the moment before a storm announces itself. She turned. He was standing at the far edge of the market square, motionless among the moving crowd, as if the entire world had chosen to flow around him rather than ask him to move. He was taller than she remembered. Or perhaps she had spent 4 years shrinking the memory of him down to a size that was manageable to carry. His shoulders were still broad beneath the dark traveling coat. His jaw was still sharp. His hair, longer now, still fell across his forehead in the way that had once made her reach up without thinking to push it aside. And his eyes had not moved from her face, not when the merchant beside him called for his attention, not when a child ran laughing between them, not when a cart horse shied and clattered against the cobblestones and half the market turned to look. He stood perfectly still, as if the act of looking away from her was something his body had simply forgotten how to do. Sonara forgot how to breathe. 4 years. She had counted them in seasons and in Oren's milestones, and in the slow, deliberate work of becoming someone new. She had told herself, in the first raw months, that the pain would eventually stop feeling like a wound and start feeling like a scar. She had been right about that. What she had not anticipated was how completely a scar could tear back open. She needed to move. She needed to take her son by the hand and walk away from this market square and this town, and this version of herself that was standing frozen in the open, like a woman with nothing to hide. She did not move. Oren, who had inherited his father's complete indifference to situations that called for caution, tugged her hand and raised his voice to a volume that carried cheerfully across the entire square. "Why are you staring at my mama?" The words landed the way a stone lands in still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. Several market-goers turned. The merchant beside the stranger paused mid-sentence. A woman at the herb stall looked up from her scales. The stranger's gaze dropped slowly from Sonara's face to the boy standing at her side. And for a long, suspended moment, The most powerful wolf in the kingdom of Caldenmeyer simply stood in the middle of a village market and looked at his son for the first time, without knowing yet that was what he was doing. Sonara watched the confusion move across Doran's face. The slight narrowing of those storm-gray eyes as they moved over Oren's features. The dark hair. The strong jaw that was still soft with childhood, but already promised the shape it would grow into. The unconscious echo of the boy's stance, feet slightly apart and chin lifted, mirroring the man across the square so precisely that it felt like a declaration written in bone and blood. She saw the moment the confusion shifted to something else. She pulled Oren against her side and turned to go. She had taken 4 steps when her son's voice stopped her again. "Mama, look." She looked back despite herself. Doran had not followed. He had not moved at all. But in turning to steer Oren away, her son had reached up to grip her arm for balance, and the motion had pulled back the cuff of the boy's sleeve. On the inside of Oren's small wrist, pale and precise as if drawn by a careful hand, sat a mark. A mark Sonara had spent 4 years telling herself she did not understand. A mark she had kissed goodnight every evening since he was born. A mark she had assumed was something unique to him, something he had come into the world carrying, and something that had no explanation and required none. It was identical to the one burned into her own skin. And across the square, Doran's eyes were locked on his son's wrist, and the expression on his face was no longer confusion. It was recognition. She did not run. Running would draw eyes, and she had spent 4 years learning to do nothing that drew eyes. She walked. She walked with her hand wrapped around Oren's, her basket over her arm, her face composed into the pleasant neutrality of a woman with errands to complete, and nothing else on her mind. She walked through the market and down the narrow lane that led to the healer's cottage at the edge of the meadow, and she did not look back. Not once. She waited until the door was closed and bolted, and Oren had been settled at the table with his preserves and a wooden puzzle before she allowed herself to sit and breathe and fall apart. She pressed her hands flat on her knees to stop them trembling. Doran, of all the market days, all the ordinary, unremarkable mornings of her ordinary, unremarkable life, he had walked into this one, into this town, into this square, into that Tuesday in late spring that she had chosen to buy fennel and linen and a small jar of preserves for a 4-year-old, who had already forgotten the dramatic encounter with the stranger and was now making the carved pieces of his puzzle gallop across the table with accompanying sound effects. She watched her son and tried to remember how to be a woman who was not afraid. It had not always been like this. That was the cruelest part of it. There had been a time when the thought of Doran did not produce fear at all, when it produced the opposite. She had come to the royal court of Caldenmeyer as a junior healer in the household staff, hired on the recommendation of the palace physician who had trained her. She had been 22 years old and without illusions about what her place in that world was. She was common-born. She had no house name, no bloodline, and no political value. She was there to mend wounds and brew medicines and be invisible between appointments. She had been extraordinarily good at being invisible. Right up until the night the king had been thrown from his horse during a storm patrol and carried into the healing ward with a dislocated shoulder and a gash along his ribs that had bled through 2 bandages before anyone thought to send for her. She had set the shoulder without asking his permission. He had been too surprised to object. She had cleaned and stitched the wound with her hands steady and her attention on her work, and her complete failure to be overwhelmed by the fact that she was stitching up the Alpha King of Caldenmeyer at 2 in the morning by candlelight. He had watched her the entire time. "You are not afraid of me," he had said when she was tying off the last stitch. "You are my patient," she had told him. At the moment. He had laughed. A real laugh, not the controlled sound she had heard him produce in the great hall. Something unguarded and surprised, and unlike the version of him that stood on raised daises and reviewed treaties. That had been the beginning. It had taken 3 months of careful, impossible, absolutely inadvisable proximity before either of them acknowledged what was happening. 3 months of her appearing at the healing ward at the hours she was needed, and him appearing there at hours when he was not wounded and had no credible reason to be present. 3 months of conversations that lasted longer than they should have, of a connection that neither of them had language for yet, of a pull that intensified rather than faded the more time passed. The night he had told her she was his fated mate, she had been sitting on the low stone wall of the inner courtyard watching the stars, and he had sat beside her and said it plainly and directly, as if it were a fact he had been sitting with for some time, and had finally decided she deserved to know. She had not doubted him. That was the part that still made her chest ache, years later. She had not doubted him for a single moment. She had looked at the man who spoke her name like he had only just learned how valuable language was, and she had believed every word. They had kept it secret by necessity. The council was already pressing him toward a formal alliance. He needed time, he told her. Time to manage the politics, to position the announcement in a way that the noble houses could not challenge. She had understood. She had agreed. She had waited, quietly and completely, because she trusted him in the way that only the young or the foolish trust another person, with no conditions and no exit plan. She had been 23 years old. She had been a fool. Or so she had believed, for 4 years, in this cottage, in this town, with the mark on her wrist and the boy at her table, and the cold company of a love she had never stopped feeling even after she had convinced herself she should. Now she was not so sure what she had been. She had not been invited to the ceremony. No one had told her it was happening. There had been no announcement in the servants' quarters, no whispered warning from a friendly face, no note slipped under her door to prepare her for what was coming. She had found out the way the rest of the common-born did. A conversation between 2 household guards, overheard through a cracked door, in the hour before dawn on a morning that had otherwise seemed ordinary. The selection rite, the ancient tradition by which an alpha king of Caldenmeyer formally chose his bonded queen from among the daughters of the high houses. It had not been performed in a generation. The last king had chosen his mate through a private bonding, without ceremony, and the noble houses had never quite forgiven him for it. Doran's counsel, Sonara had learned in the hours of frantic whispered questions that followed, had been petitioning him for months to perform the rite properly, to stand before the assembled houses and make his choice with the full weight of tradition behind it. He had not told her. She tried to find reasons why. There were reasons. She knew there were. She had told herself the same things she had been telling herself for 7 months of careful, hidden, borrowed happiness. That he was managing forces she did not fully see, that the timing required patience, that his silence on certain subjects was protection and not dismissal. She tried to believe those things as she stood in the gallery above the great chamber of Varanthos, hidden behind a carved stone pillar, and watched the ceremony begin. The hall below was filled to capacity. Every noble house in Caldenmeyer had sent representatives, their house colors bright against the pale stone floor. Banners hung from every arch, hundreds of candles blazed in iron rings suspended from the vaulted ceiling. The combined heat of so many bodies and so many flames turned the air thick and golden, as if the room itself were holding its breath. She had arrived early enough to secure a position where she could see clearly without being seen. Old instinct. She had spent her entire adult life perfecting the art of watching without being observed. She was good at it. What she was not good at, it turned out, was watching the man she loved walk into that hall. Doran entered from the northern door dressed in the formal colors of the crown, black and deep silver, and his expression composed and unreadable from above. He moved to the raised platform at the center of the chamber with the controlled, deliberate stride of a man who had prepared himself for this moment and intended to execute it without error. She watched him and felt the mark on her wrist pulse with heat. He would feel that too, she had always assumed. The mark responded to proximity and emotion both, and she was close enough that he should have felt the heat of it. He should have known she was here. He did not look up. 5 women descended the wide steps from the eastern gallery, each one dressed in white, each one representing one of the 5 great houses that had spent years angling for exactly this moment. They moved with the practiced grace of women who had been prepared for this possibility since childhood. Their faces were composed. Their steps were measured. They were everything that Sonara was not. And she had always known that, and had chosen to believe it did not matter. At the head of the 5 walked a woman Sonara recognized, Valith of House Morcaine. She was extraordinary to look at. There was no point pretending otherwise. Tall and composed, with the kind of controlled beauty that spoke of generations of careful breeding and careful living. She moved as if the floor had been designed specifically for her entrance. Her pale eyes swept the room with the assurance of a woman who already knew how this would end. The High Lorekeeper of Caldenmeyer raised his voice above the gathered crowd. Doran, Alpha King of Caldenmeyer, Sovereign of the 5 territories, blood of the founding line. The houses of the realm stand witness. Make your choice, and let the bond of tradition seal it before all gathered here. Sonara's hand pressed flat against the pillar. The stone was cold under her palm. Her wrist burned. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Doran stood motionless on the platform. Something was wrong with the way he was standing. She registered it without being able to name it. A stillness that was not the stillness of composure. A quality to his expression that she had never seen on his face in all the months she had known him. In all the unguarded hours in the healing ward and the courtyard, and the quiet of the forest where no one watched, and he was just himself. He did not look like himself. He looked like a man who was not entirely present, a man whose body was performing a function while the part of him that mattered was somewhere else, or was simply gone. She did not understand it. She filed it away, that wrongness, that absence, without finding a name for it, because in the next moment he stepped forward. "I choose," he said, and his voice carried to every corner of the chamber. Valith of House Morcaine. The hall came apart with celebration. Sonara did not hear it. She was already pressing her back against the cold stone, both hands over her mouth, a single thought cutting through everything else with the clean precision of a blade. She was carrying his child, and he had just chosen another woman to be his queen. Outside the gallery windows, the capital city of Varanthos had begun to light its celebration fires. She could see the glow of them through the high glass, orange and gold against the darkening sky, burning brighter with every passing minute. She watched them and felt something inside her close down, quietly and completely, like a door being shut from the inside. She understood, at last, and without any room left for doubt, that the life she had been standing in had just ended. Whatever came next would have to be built from whatever remained. She left Varanthos on foot, not because she had no other choice, but because a horse required coin she could not spend without leaving a record, and a cart required a driver who would remember her face. She left in the hour before dawn, with a traveling pack on her back, and her grandmother's ring sewn into the lining of her boot, and the mark on her wrist burning steadily, as it had been burning since the moment Doran stepped forward on that platform and spoke another woman's name. She walked north, not because north offered any clear answer, but because south led back to the valley where she had been born, and she could not go there, could not show up on her mother's doorstep with a king's child in her womb and a story that no one would believe. She walked for 9 days. She slept in barns and under hedgerows, and once in the back room of a roadside inn whose keeper asked no questions in exchange for her mending 3 of his workers' injuries with a competence that clearly exceeded what he had expected from a woman traveling alone. She ate what she could find or barter for. She kept her wrist covered. She kept moving. She found Crenwell by accident on the 10th day, when her boots gave out on a road that turned to mud, and she stopped at the first cluster of buildings she could see. The village had a well and a bakehouse and a market cross worn smooth by centuries of hands, and a healer's cottage that had been sitting empty since the previous occupant had died the winter before, and an elder council willing to offer it to a young widow with demonstrable skills in exchange for taking on the work her predecessor had left undone. She said yes before they had finished the offer. She told them her name was Mira. She told them her husband had died of a fever in the city, and she needed somewhere quiet to grieve and begin again. They nodded and brought her soup and left her to settle in. And she sat in the small stone cottage with her pack on the floor and her hands on her belly and understood, perhaps for the first time, that she had actually escaped. Oren was born in the deep of winter, 7 months after she arrived. The village midwife attended her, a steady-handed woman named Pell who had delivered half the children in Krenwald and had seen enough of the world to ask nothing about the father beyond whether she should expect him to appear. Sonara said no. Pell nodded and moved on. He was born at dawn, which Pell said was a good omen, and he arrived in the world with his eyes wide open, which Pell said she had never seen in 30 years of midwifery. He looked up at Sonara with those dark, serious eyes, and she understood immediately that she was going to love him in a way that would rearrange everything. He had Doran's jaw, his ears, his hands, even in those first hours, curled loosely at his sides as if ready for whatever came next, and on the inside of his left wrist, precise and pale, a mark that had not been there when she went into labor. Sonara had stared at it for a long time. She touched it carefully, half expecting it to disappear. It did not. It was warm and permanent and identical in every detail to the one she had been carrying since the night Doran pressed his lips to her wrist in the courtyard and told her she was his. She had no explanation for it. She did not know what it meant that the bond had reached into the next generation and left its signature on a child who had not yet drawn breath when it was formed. She covered his wrist with his swaddling cloth and told herself it was something she would understand later. Later became 4 years. 4 years of mornings that smelled of bread and river mud. 4 years of a boy who galloped wooden puzzle pieces across tables and argued with flawless 4-year-old logic. 4 years of a life that was small and real and entirely hers, and all of it, every day of it, lived at a careful distance from the truth she had left burning behind her in Varanthos. The traders came through Krenwald twice a year, in spring and autumn, and Sonara had made a practice of being elsewhere when they arrived. Not because she feared them specifically, but because traders talked, and the things they talked about most freely were the things happening in the capital. And in the early years, she had not been strong enough yet to hear those things without coming apart. In the first spring after she arrived, she had been too deep in the fog of new motherhood to pay much attention to anything beyond Oren's needs and the demands of her patients. By the second spring, she had developed the discipline to listen to market gossip with her face neutral and her hands occupied and her heart locked behind whatever she had built to keep it manageable. She heard things, over those years, fragments, pieces of a larger picture she was never quite able to assemble fully. She heard that the Alpha King of Caldenmeyer had refused to complete his bonding with Valeth of House Morcaine, that the selection rite had been witnessed and acknowledged, but the ceremonial bond had never been sealed, that the king had confined himself to the capital and rejected every diplomatic summons and dismissed 3 councils in succession, and that his closest advisors moved around him with the careful deliberateness of people navigating a room containing something that might, without warning, explode. She heard that the Eastern grain stores had failed 2 seasons running, which the old women in the market blamed on disrupted ley lines, and the young men blamed on poor drainage, and which Sonara, who understood more than either group about the way an alpha's inner state could ripple outward through a territory, blamed on something else altogether. She heard in the autumn of the 3rd year that the king had sent search parties to every province, that he was looking for someone, that no description had been made public, which was strange, which suggested that the king either did not want the subject of his search to know she was being sought, or that he was protecting her identity from something by keeping it hidden. She heard this and felt her mark burn for 3 days without stopping. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she was interpreting fragments into a story she wanted to be true because the alternative, the version where it meant nothing, was less bearable. Then she saw him in the market, and all the careful distance she had maintained over 4 years collapsed in a single moment. And now she was back in her cottage with the door bolted and her mind moving fast through the question of how quickly she could have them both packed and gone before morning. She was pulling the traveling pack from the top of the wardrobe when she heard it. 2 women, passing in the lane outside her window. Neighbors, friends. The kind of people she had shared 4 years of ordinary mornings with. Their voices were low and conspiratorial, carrying the hushed intimacy of people sharing something they had not yet decided whether to believe. "The miller's son came back from the capital last week," the first voice said. "Says there are king's riders in every village between here and the Greyvale Road." "Looking for someone?" the second voice asked. "Looking for a woman, young, a healer." A pause. "He says the description matches Armira exactly." Silence. "They are saying," the first voice dropped lower, "that she is not a widow at all, that she is someone the king has been searching for since before the boy was born, that she did not come from the city to grieve, that she came from the capital to hide." Another pause. Longer this time. "They are saying she is the king's true mate," the first voice said, "and that someone at court already knows exactly where she is." Sonara stood with her hands on the traveling pack and did not breathe. She had been so careful. 9 days of walking and a false name and 4 years of unremarkable Tuesday mornings. She had been so extraordinarily careful. It had not been enough. Someone had already found her. Not him. Someone else. Someone who had known where she was and had not yet decided what to do with the information. The voices outside moved away down the lane and the cottage went quiet again. Sonara looked at Oren. Oren was already at the back door. She did not speak to Doran. She could not. There were no words available to her in that moment that were not either accusations or confessions, and she was not ready for either. She looked at him, crouched in her garden with his storm-gray eyes full of something she had no name for, and she took Oren by the hand and said, in a voice that was entirely steady, that it was time to come inside. Oren protested. Oren had opinions about this, delivered with considerable force. She moved him through the door anyway, and closed it behind them, and stood in her kitchen with her back against the wood, and her eyes closed, and her heart doing something violent and involuntary in her chest. "He seems sad," Oren said. "Finish your preserves." "He does, though." "Oren." The boy subsided, with the characteristic loud silence of a child who has more to say, and is choosing to save it for a more strategic moment. Sonara opened her eyes. She needed to pack. She needed to take her son and her grandmother's ring and her most portable medicines, and she needed to be gone from Crenwold before whatever was happening in her garden had time to become something she could not walk away from. She was gathering her medicines from the shelf above the hearth when she heard a knock at the front door. Not Doran. The knock was too measured, too deliberate, carrying a rhythm she recognized instantly, the careful approach of someone trained to signal their intentions before a door opened. Someone who had done this before. Someone who understood that a frightened woman with a child was more dangerous than she looked. She did not move. The knock came again. "My lady." The voice was male, older, roughened by years of use. "My name is Aldwin. I serve as first counsel to the king. I have come alone and I am unarmed, and I have been traveling for 11 days to reach you, which I mention not to solicit sympathy but only to explain that I am quite tired and would very much like to speak with you before you disappear again." Sonara did not move. "I know you are considering it," Aldwin continued, from the other side of the door. "Disappearing. You have done it once with remarkable thoroughness, and I have no doubt you could do it again. I am asking you not to. Not yet. Give me a quarter of an hour." Sonara looked at Oren. Oren looked back at her with his dark, serious eyes and said, "He smells like the capital." She opened the door. Aldwin was older than she had expected. His hair was white at the temples, his face deeply lined, his traveling clothes worn to the honest shabbiness of someone who had prioritized speed over appearance. He looked at her with the careful assessment of a man who had been searching for something important for a long time and was not yet certain he had actually found it. "You are smaller than the king described," he said. "How did you find me?" she asked. "The bond," he said. "The king has been following it for months." "I followed the king." He paused. "May I come in?" She stepped back. He entered, accepted the chair she indicated, declined tea, and folded his hands on the table with the settled air of a man organizing himself for something he had rehearsed and still found difficult. "What I am about to tell you," Aldwin said, "will require you to reconsider everything you believed about the day of the selection rite." Sonara sat down across from him. Her wrist was burning. It had been burning since the market, a steady, insistent heat she had been trying to ignore for hours. "The ceremony you witnessed," Aldwin said, "was not a ceremony in which the king made a choice." She said nothing. 3 hours before the rite was performed, someone introduced a compound into the king's wine. We have since identified it as a combination of crushed silver root and a derivative of the blackstone herb found only in the northern reaches of House Morcaine's territory. Aldwin's voice was even and precise, the voice of a man delivering a report he had delivered before. Together, those compounds suppress the wolf entirely, not temporarily, not partially, completely. For the duration of their effect, the subject has no access to instinct, no access to the bond, no access to any of the faculties that would allow a wolf of the king's caliber to resist an external directive. Sonara heard the words. She understood them individually. "He was given a directive," Aldwin continued, "by Lord Morcaine's men in the hour before the rite, while the king was in a state in which he could neither question nor refuse the instruction. He was told what to say. He was told whose name to speak. And he said it, before the assembled houses of Caldenmeyer, with no more will behind it than a man talking in his sleep." The kitchen was quiet. "He woke from it on the second day," Aldwin said. "He remembered nothing of the ceremony, nothing of the rite. His first coherent words, when he understood what had been done and what he had apparently declared in front of the entire kingdom, were your name." Sonara pressed her hands flat on the table. The mark on her wrist pulsed with a heat so immediate and specific that it felt, for a moment, like a hand closing around hers. "4 years," she said, and her voice came out barely above a whisper. "He has been searching for 4 years. Without stopping," Aldwin said. "Without sleeping adequately, without governing adequately, which his council has found considerably less romantic than I suspect you might." A pause. "There are those among the noble houses who have called it obsession. His wolf has called it something simpler." Sonara looked at the table. She thought about the ceremony fires burning through the gallery windows, the stillness she had seen in him on that platform, the wrongness she had registered and filed away without a name. She had given it a name. She had called it indifference. She had called it rejection. She had built 4 years of her life on top of that name, and now Aldwin was sitting across from her and telling her she had been wrong. She was still processing this when he spoke again. "There is one more thing I need to tell you." His tone had changed. The precision was still there, but beneath it sat something heavier. "House Morcaine has known about the boy since last winter." The air went out of the room. "They have known his name, his age and his location since a trader from Krenwold passed through the capital in the month of frost and was asked, over an apparently friendly drink, whether anything unusual had occurred in the village in recent years." Aldwin's eyes met hers steadily. "They sent a report to Lord Morcaine within the week. We intercepted a copy by chance. We have been moving toward you since the day we read it." Sonara's gaze went to Oren, who had fallen asleep at the table with his head on his arms, undisturbed by the quiet devastation occurring 3 feet away from him. They want him, she said. They want to use him, Aldwin said. A child who carries the king's bond mark in his own skin is not simply an heir, he is proof. Proof that the true mate bond was never broken. Proof that the selection rite was a fraud. Proof that House Morcaine's hold on the crown is built on a foundation that a single living child can dismantle altogether. He paused. They cannot afford for him to reach the king. Sonara looked at her sleeping son. At the mark on his wrist, visible where his sleeve had fallen back. How long do we have? She asked. Aldwin's answer was not the one she needed. Their people were 2 days behind mine when I left the last waypost, he said quietly. That was 4 days ago. Sonara was already standing. Aldwin was already on his feet. We need to move, he said, with the controlled urgency of a man who had been in situations like this before and understood that panic was a luxury they could not afford. Now, the king's wolves can hold the road, but not indefinitely. If Morcaine's people have been tracking me as well as you, they will know this location. They have been tracking you, Sonara said. Not a question. The answer was already obvious. Aldwin did not insult her by pretending otherwise. She crossed to Oren and lifted him from the table, his sleep-warm weight settling against her shoulder. He stirred, blinking, and looked past her face to the doorway behind her. His eyes focused. He went utterly still, with the depth of a child registering something important. Doran, he said. Not the king, not the stranger from the market. His name, spoken with the easy familiarity of someone saying a word they had always known, in the voice of a child who had never heard it from anyone. Sonara turned. Doran stood in the doorway from the garden, having entered silently. He was looking at the boy. His face had gone the color of old ash. What did you say? He asked, and his voice dropped to almost nothing. Oren blinked at him, unconcerned. That is your name, he said, with flawless 4-year-old certainty. I have always known it. I just did not know it was you. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It was broken by the sound of glass shattering at the back of the cottage. Aldwin moved first, pulling a short blade from inside his coat and positioning himself between the broken window and the room. 2 shapes dropped through the frame, already drawing weapons, their movements carrying the coordinated precision of trained hunters rather than ordinary soldiers. Morcaine's people, not guards, not militia, killers, sent for a specific purpose. Take the boy, Aldwin said to Sonara without looking away from the threat. Back door, now. But the back door was already blocked. A figure filled the frame, broad-shouldered and masked, with a long blade in each hand. They were surrounded. Doran shed his coat in one movement and placed himself directly in front of Sonara and Oren, his back to them, his body a wall between his family and the weapons converging on the room. The word arrived in Sonara's mind without ceremony. Family. One of the assassins laughed, short and contemptuous. Step aside, my lord. Our business is with the woman and the boy. You have complicated things enough already. My business, Doran said, and his voice had dropped to something quiet and absolute that Sonara had never heard from him before, is the only thing currently standing between you and what I am about to do to you. He was not boasting, he was stating a fact. The assassin at the back door moved first, lunging toward Sonara with his blade extended. Doran spun and met him with a speed that should not have been possible in the confined space of a cottage kitchen, taking the blow on his forearm and driving the man backward through the doorframe with the force of someone who had stopped calculating risk at all. The remaining 2 assassins came at him from both sides. Sonara pushed Oren behind her, pressing him against the wall, putting herself between her son and the chaos filling the room. Her mark was burning. Not the steady pulse she had grown accustomed to over 4 years. Something rawer, something closer to a reckoning than a warning. Aldwin was fighting the 2 at the window with a competence that belied his age and his tired traveling clothes, holding them at a standoff but unable to advance. From outside came the sounds of a larger battle. Doran's wolves, she realized, arriving at the edges of the fight. She could feel him through the bond, a blazing certainty that radiated through her wrist and up her arm and into her chest. Then she felt something else. One of the Morcane soldiers had broken from the fight outside and pushed into the cottage from a side she had not anticipated. He crossed the room in 3 strides, past Aldwyn, past Doran, directly toward her, with a single-minded focus that told her this one had been given a specific instruction. Not her. The boy. Oren, who had been pressed against the wall behind Sonara, stepped out from behind his mother. He spread his arms wide. He was 4 years old and he barely reached the soldier's belt, and he stood there in the wreckage of their cottage kitchen with his small feet planted and his chin lifted in his father's exact stance, and he said in a voice that carried no fear at all, "You are not having my mama." The soldier paused. Not from sentiment, from the mark. It was blazing. Both marks, on Oren's wrist and on Sonara's, blazing with a light that was neither fire nor sun but something older than either, filling the room with a warmth that pressed against the chest like a hand and made the soldier's grip on his blade loosen by a single degree. It was enough. Sonara's power did not announce itself. It did not build or gather or require preparation. It simply arrived, the way something long restrained arrives when the last obstacle is finally removed, complete and immediate and overwhelming. Gold light poured from her hands, from the mark on her wrist, from Oren's small outstretched arms where his own mark blazed in answer. The soldier stumbled back. The 2 at the window dropped their weapons and shielded their eyes. The one Doran had driven through the doorframe scrambled to his feet and ran. What remained of the Morcane force in and around the cottage retreated toward the tree line at the edge of the meadow. But not all of them. A figure stepped from the shadows of the lane, tall, unhurried, dressed in Morcane's colors with a commander's authority in every line of her posture. Vaelith. She looked at the blazing light still fading from Sonara's hands with an expression that contained no fear whatsoever, only cold calculation. "Impressive," she said, "and completely irrelevant." She looked at Oren, then back at Sonara. "You care about this village? The people in it? The old midwife? The neighbors who have been kind to you for 4 years?" A pause. "My soldiers know where all of them live. One signal from me, and this village learns what it costs to shelter the king's inconvenient secrets." The gold light went out. Sonara looked at Oren's face, at the absolute trust in his dark eyes as he watched her work out what to do. She looked at Doran, breathing hard at the door, his eyes blazing, his every instinct clearly screaming at him to move. She looked at Vaelith. "Let the village alone," Sonara said. "Let them all alone. Take me instead." The words left her mouth clearly and without trembling. Doran made a sound that was not human. Vaelith smiled. "You and the boy." "Me," Sonara said. "Alone. The boy stays." The smile did not waver. "You and the boy. Or the village burns." Sonara closed her eyes for one breath. She opened them and stepped forward. "Then take us both." They were taken to the elder hall at the center of the village. Morcane's soldiers had occupied it before dawn, which explained why no one in Crenwold had raised an alarm. The elders had been moved to their homes and told to stay there. The hall had been cleared and its hearth lit, and its doors bolted from the inside, and Vaelith sat in the elder's chair at the head of the room as naturally as if she had been sitting in chairs like that her entire life. Which, Sonara supposed, she had. Oren was asleep on the bench beside her, his head in her lap, his wrist mark faintly warm beneath her fingers where she held his hand. He had fallen asleep almost immediately after they arrived, which was the uncomplicated mercy of a 4-year-old body that had reached its limit for the day. Sonara had been watching the room, counting soldiers, noting the layout, trying to find the version of this that ended with her son still breathing. She had not yet found it. The side door of the hall opened without warning. Doran stepped through it. He was alone, which meant he had either overpowered the guards outside or they had merely looked at him and stepped back. Neither scenario surprised her. He was bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow, and his traveling coat was gone, and his eyes were fixed on her with an expression so stripped of composure that it looked less like a face and more like a wound. Valith straightened in the elder's chair. "You were told to stay outside?" she said. "You were told," Doran replied without looking at her, "that threatening my mate and my son would have consequences. I am here to deliver them." He paused. "But first, I need a moment." It was directed at Sonara, not at Valith, not at the guards who had moved to the edges of the room. At Sonara, with a simplicity that made the entire formal structure of the standoff feel irrelevant. Valith made a gesture. The soldiers held their positions. She was, Sonara noted grimly, intelligent enough to understand that Doran alone was more dangerous than all of them combined, and that the only thing currently keeping him from demonstrating that was whatever he needed to say. He crossed the room and crouched before the bench where she sat with Oren's sleeping weight across her lap. His eyes moved over her face, over Oren's, over the mark on his son's wrist, still faintly glowing even in sleep. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. A pause. He looked at Oren again. "He called me by name," Doran said quietly. "Without being told? He has always known it. I do not know how. The bond, even before he was born. He was connected to it, to both of us." He reached out very slowly and touched the back of the sleeping boy's hand with his fingertips, the lightest possible contact, as if he was afraid of breaking something. "He looks like you," he said, "around the eyes." "He looks like you," she said, "around everything else." Something moved across Doran's face. Then he looked up at her, and the careful restraint he had been maintaining since the market square cracked open, and what was underneath it was not anger or demand or the imperial authority she had been bracing herself for. It was grief, raw and unmistakable, and 4 years deep. "I never stopped looking for you," he said. Not a declaration, not a plea. A statement of bare fact, delivered in the voice of a man reporting something he had lived through and was still living. Sonara felt the walls she had been reinforcing since that morning begin to shift. "You chose her," she said. "I watched you. I was standing in that gallery and I watched you say her name and take her hand, and I watched you not look for me in that crowd once. Not once." "I know," he said. "I know what you saw. Aldwin told me, after he found me on the road outside this village. He told me you had been in that gallery, that you had watched everything." His jaw tightened. "I cannot give you back what that cost you. I cannot stand here and tell you that the 4 years you spent alone with our son were anything other than a theft. They were stolen from all 3 of us. And I will spend whatever remains of my life making sure the people who stole them never have the opportunity to steal anything from anyone again. I thought you did not want me." The words came out stripped of everything. No armor, no management. Just the bare truth of what she had believed for 4 years. "I thought everything you said to me in that courtyard was something you said to a woman you intended to discard when a better option became available. I thought I had invented a version of you that did not exist." Doran closed his eyes. "You invented nothing," he said. "Every word I spoke to you in that courtyard was the most honest thing I have ever said to anyone. My wolf chose you before I had the language for it. The bond recognized you the first night in the healing ward, before either of us understood what was happening." He opened his eyes. "I woke from what they did to me, and the first thing I felt was the bond screaming. And I knew, before I could remember my own name, that you were gone, and that I had failed you." Sonara looked at him for a long moment. "I had words," she said, "that I was going to say to you. The night of the rite. I had practiced them. I was going to tell you that I was carrying your child. I had said them in that little room 100 times so I would not lose my nerve when I actually stood in front of you." She paused. I never got to say them. Say them now, Doran said. Her eyes went to Orin. At the man crouched before her with 4 years of grief written into every line of his face. You are going to be a father, she said, in the voice she had practiced in a small stone room, steady and clear and exactly as she had planned it. And I am terrified and I am not sorry, and I need you to tell me that we are doing this together. Because I cannot do it alone. I have tried and I am good at it, and I do not want to do it alone anymore. The last words were not the ones she had practiced, but they were true. Doran's hand covered hers on the bench. Together, he said, from this moment, Sinara. Whatever comes next. Whatever comes next arrived at that precise moment in the form of a figure stepping from the shadow behind Valeth's chair. Not a soldier. A woman, slight and swift, with a blade already drawn and already moving toward the bench where Sinara sat with her sleeping son. Valeth did not look at her or give a spoken order. The signal had been arranged in advance. A betrayal within the false truce, launched in the moment they were most distracted. Doran was on his feet in the space between one heartbeat and the next, moving toward the threat with a speed that turned the air in the room electric. He was fast. Orin was faster. The boy woke between one breath and the next, sitting upright with his wrist raised, and the mark blazed white and absolute in the dim hall, and the woman with the blade stumbled as if she had run into a wall she had not seen, dropping the weapon and falling back with a cry that contained more shock than pain. The light from Orin's wrist pulsed once, twice, and then every candle in the elder hall blazed to full brightness, and every shadow in the room retreated to the walls, and Valeth of House Morcaine looked at the 4-year-old boy sitting upright on the bench, with his arm raised and his eyes blazing gold, and for the first time since Sinara had ever seen her, she took one step backward. Valeth ran, not in panic. In the calculated retreat of a woman who understood that the field had changed, and that the intelligent response to a changed field was to reposition rather than stand in the light of a 4-year-old's blazing bond mark and pretend she was not outmatched. Her soldiers followed. All of them. The ones inside the hall and the ones outside in the lane and the ones at the edges of the village who had been holding positions they abandoned without hesitation. Sinara heard the sound of them going, boots on cobblestones, the distant thud of hooves as Morcaine's riders took the southern road. Aldwyn appeared in the doorway of the hall, breathing hard, a fresh cut along his jaw. She is taking the road back to Varanthos, he said. She will go to her father. If Lord Morcaine seals the capital before we arrive, the gates will hold against even the king's wolves. Doran looked at Sinara. A question, not a command. She looked at her son. Orin was sitting quietly on the bench, his wrist no longer blazing, and his expression the perfectly ordinary expression of a child who has done something natural and cannot understand why everyone in the room looks so shaken. I want to see the capital, Orin said. You said it has a very tall tower. Sinara had not said that. She had never spoken to him about Varanthos at all. She met Doran's eyes. He knows things, she said quietly. Things I never told him. Things from the bond, I think. Things that bled through even before he was born. Doran crouched before his son again. Eye level. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and gentle in a register he had apparently discovered in the last hour. The tower, he said to Orin, is taller than any building you have ever seen. You can see the entire kingdom from the top of it on a clear day. I know, Orin said. Doran looked at him for a moment. Yes, he said. I suppose you do. They left Crenwold before the sun had fully risen. Doran's wolves, a company of 12 who had held the roads around the village through the night, fell in around them as they rode. Aldwyn took point with 2 of the riders. Sinara rode with Orin settled in front of her, his back against her chest, his eyes wide and intent on every new thing the road offered. Doran rode beside her, not ahead, not behind, beside. They did not speak for the first hour. There was too much still unsettled between them for casual words, and neither of them reached for casual words. What they had said in the elder hall had been real and necessary, and it had opened something that would need time to close properly. Grief did not resolve in a single night, no matter how much both parties wished it would. But the bond between them was different now. The burning she had lived with for 4 years, that insistent, unrelenting heat, had shifted into something else. Something that felt less like a wound demanding attention and more like a compass that had finally found north. She could feel him beside her, not just with her physical senses, but with something deeper. The bond breathing between them the way it had always been meant to, freely and fully, no longer straining across distance and silence. Oren felt it too. She could tell from the way he kept looking between them with a quiet satisfaction, as if watching something slot into place that he had always known was supposed to be there. They reached the outskirts of Varanthos as evening was pulling the light from the sky. The capital was, as Sonara remembered it, immense and ancient, and built as if the people who constructed it had intended it to last forever. The great walls rose against the darkening sky in pale stone. The tower Oren had somehow always known about rose above everything else, its top lost in the evening clouds. But the gates were closed, and on the walls above them, Morcaine's standard flew. Aldwin pulled his horse alongside Doran. "She made better time than we anticipated. Lord Morcaine has locked the city." "He cannot lock it against the king," Doran said. "He has told the gatehouse that the king is compromised, that he travels with a foreign witch, who has bewitched him, and his judgment cannot be trusted." Aldwin's voice was flat with professional contempt. "It is the same strategy they used at the selection rite. Discredit before confronting." Sonara looked at the closed gates. Behind those gates were people she had known, the palace physician who had trained her, the household staff who had been kind when they did not need to be, the people who had been living for 4 years under a cloud created by House Morcaine's ambition. "There is a way in," she said. Both men looked at her. "The healing ward has a service entrance on the eastern wall. It is used for bringing in supplies without going through the main corridors. It will not be guarded because Morcaine's people will not know it exists. I used it almost every day for 2 years." She paused. "I can get us inside." "Sonara," Doran said. "I know the city," she said. "I know where Lord Morcaine will have positioned his people. I know where the loyal household staff will have been confined. I know where Valeth will go when she gets inside those walls." She looked at him steadily. "You need me for this part." A long pause. "I need you for every part," Doran said quietly. "That is not the concern. The concern is sending you through a wall in the dark while Lord Morcaine's people are on alert." "The concern," Sonara said, "is that people inside those walls are confined in the lower household rooms because they refuse to serve under Morcaine's authority. People who cooked and cleaned and tended the wounded and who are now prisoners because they were loyal when loyalty was costly." She held his gaze. "I am not leaving them there." Doran was quiet for a moment. Then he said to Aldwin, "Take 8 of the wolves to the main gate and make enough noise to constitute a serious distraction." To Sonara he said, "Show me the eastern wall." She got them in through the service door in the time it took Aldwin's company to begin their assault on the front gate. 14 people, moving in silence through the service corridors of a palace she had memorized over 2 years of early mornings and late nights. She led them to the lower household rooms where the confined staff were being held under guard. She knew the corridor. She knew the guard rotation because Morcaine's commander had set it up following the same manual the royal guard always used, and she had studied that manual during a quiet winter 3 years ago because knowledge was the only currency she had always been able to carry. Doran cleared the guards. Sonara opened the doors. 31 people, blinking in the sudden torchlight, looking at the woman who had vanished from this palace 4 years ago, and the king who had been searching for her ever since. "Mistress Sonara," said the palace physician from the back of the room, with the unhurried composure of a man who had seen a great deal and was no longer easily surprised. "You look well. We need to move," she said. "All of you. Now." It was in the eastern courtyard, with the 31 freed staff filing toward safety through the service gate, that Doran took her hand. Not strategically, not for the purpose of the bond or the ceremony or the politics of any of it. He took her hand in the dark and the noise and the chaos of a palace being reclaimed from people who had never deserved to hold it, and held it. On her other side, Oren reached up and took her other hand, and then, with the solemn instinct of a 4-year-old who understood that this moment was important, he reached across and took his father's hand as well. The three of them stood connected in the dark courtyard, while the sound of the battle at the front gate grew louder and the tide of it shifted, and the bond between Sonara and Doran, which had been burning without completion for nearly 5 years, closed. The mark on Sonara's wrist blazed gold one final time. On the inside of Doran's wrist, a mirror image of that same mark, faint as old silver until this moment, answered it with a light that rose and steadied and held. Not in a ceremony, not on a dais before assembled houses, in a courtyard at night, with a child's hand between theirs. It was, Sonara thought, exactly right. Lord Morcaine surrendered before dawn. He had no choice. With the king's wolves holding the main gate, and Doran's company having freed the loyal household staff and secured the inner corridors, the Morcaine forces found themselves fighting to hold a palace that had already been taken back from them while they were focused on the walls. Vaelith was found in the upper gallery, still in her traveling clothes, her hands folded in her lap, and her expression composed with the practiced dignity of a woman who had decided that if things were to end badly, they would end with her looking undefeated. She said nothing when the king's wolves came for her. She rose, straightened her coat, and walked out ahead of them. It was, Sonara thought, the most honest thing she had ever seen Vaelith do. Lord Morcaine was another matter. He argued. He invoked tradition, treaty, the binding nature of the selection right, the testimony of 12 noble houses who had witnessed the king's declaration. Doran listened to all of it with the specific patience of a man who has already decided the outcome and is waiting for the noise to stop. When Lord Morcaine finished, Doran looked at Oren. Oren was standing beside Sonara with his arms folded and his chin lifted and his wrist visible where his sleeve had fallen back. The mark blazed softly in the morning light coming through the hall's high windows. Lord Morcaine looked at the boy. Something shifted in his expression. Some quality of certainty he had carried through the night and through his argument drained out of him entirely, the way conviction abandons a man who has just seen the one thing he cannot argue against. The bond mark did not lie. Everyone in the kingdom knew what it meant. A child carrying the king's mark in his own skin was not a rumor or a claim or a political argument. It was fact written into flesh, and it had been written there before the child had drawn his first breath, which meant it predated the selection right altogether. House Morcaine's claim to the crown had never existed. The formal charges were heard before the assembled House representatives 3 days later. Lord Morcaine and Vaelith were found guilty of conspiracy against the crown, the drugging and manipulation of the Alpha King, and the attempted murder of the king's true mate and heir. Lord Morcaine was stripped of his title and his territories, and sentenced to permanent exile beyond the realm's northern border. Vaelith, whose own testimony revealed that she had been given considerably less choice in the scheme than her behavior had suggested, was stripped of her house name and remanded to a northern monastery, where she would live simply and quietly for the rest of her days. The kingdom healed the way kingdoms heal, slowly and incompletely, and with arguments about the details. The noble houses had opinions. The council had opinions. The Eastern Territories, which had failed 2 harvests running under the weight of a severed bond, recovered faster than anyone expected once the bond was whole again, as if the land itself had been holding its breath. Sonara became part of the royal household in ways that required considerable negotiation with traditions that had not anticipated someone of her history or her particular combination of skills. She healed. She advised. She learned with effort and occasional profanity that Oren picked up and deployed at strategically terrible moments, the protocols and ceremonies that had always existed in a world she had once watched from servants' corridors. She was not always graceful about it. She was never uncertain. Doran never asked her to be anything other than exactly what she was. There was a night, in the first month after the city was reclaimed, when Oren had been put to bed in a room far grander than anything he had ever known, and had been deeply unimpressed by the grandeur and wholly captivated by the window, which was large enough to sit in, and from which he could see the tower he had always known about, lit at its crown against the night sky. He had been asleep for an hour when Doran found Sonara at the window of their own room, looking out at the same tower. He came to stand beside her, and they were quiet together in the way they were learning to be quiet together, without the old weight of separation making silence feel like absence. After a while, Doran said, "Tell me his name." She looked at him. "I know what I heard his mother call him," Doran said, his voice low. "I know the name I have been carrying since Aldwyn told me about him on the road. But I want to hear you say it. I want to hear you tell me his name, the way you would have told me that night if I had been there, if none of it had happened." Sonara looked at the tower, at the man beside her, at the door down the hall behind which their son was sleeping in a room he had always, somehow, already known. "Oren," she said. "His name is Oren, and I chose it because it means the one who finds his way home." She paused. "I chose it the night he was born. I did not know then whether it was for him, or for me, or for you." Doran was quiet for a long moment. "For all of us," he said. The following morning, Oren was awake before either of them and had relocated himself to the window seat with a piece of bread from somewhere and a view of the city waking below him. When Doran appeared in the doorway, Oren looked up. "You live here," Oren said, with the satisfaction of someone confirming something they had always known. "I do," Doran said. "We live here now too," Oren said. "You do." The boy considered the city below for a moment. Then he looked up at Doran with dark, serious eyes and asked the question that had been sitting behind everything else since a spring morning in a village market, when a stranger had stood frozen in the crowd and a 4-year-old had spoken the only truth that mattered. "Are you going to stay?" Doran crossed the room and sat in the window seat beside his son and looked out at the kingdom that had been breaking and was now, slowly, beginning to mend. "Yes," he said. "I am going to stay." Oren nodded, as if this was the correct answer and he had never doubted it, and returned to his bread and his view. And in the city below, the wolves of Caldenmire lifted their voices in the morning, and the sound carried across the rooftops and over the walls and out into the valley beyond, where the fields were already showing green again for the first time in years. The boy who had asked a stranger why he was staring at his mama had found the answer he was always meant to have. And this time, no one was going anywhere.